A really large portion of the Pentateuch is comprised of laws. So how do you read the laws? You'll see a number of the laws outlined there in your book, in your textbook. So do you go through and take some and ignore others? Which laws are valid today and which ones are not? Do you just kind of skip around and pick one that you like and you say, I'm going to follow that law? Well, in this chapter, we're going to look at Introduction to Old Testament Law as a genre, talk about the traditional approach, consider the narrative context, the covenant context, and then place this in the framework of the interpretive journey, the 5 steps that we've taught you this semester, then bring it to a conclusion. Let's look at a few of these laws together that you'll read in the Old Testament. Some of them are kind of weird. Do not cook a young goat in his mother's milk. Exodus 34, verse 26. A man who has lost his hair and is bald is clean. What does that mean? Leviticus 13:40. Now here's one that's probably easily violated today. Stand up in the presence of the aged. Leviticus 19, verse 32. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear woman's clothing. Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. Here's one that's a little more familiar. Love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19, verse 8. The traditional approach to understanding Old Testament law has been to recognize 3 categories: the moral, the civil, and the ceremonial. Let's take a closer look at these. Moral laws were defined under the traditional approach as those that dealt with the timeless truths regarding God's intention for human behavior. Like this familiar law, we heard Jesus give us this: love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:8. Civil laws were those laws that described aspects that we normally see in a country's legal system. Civil law, here's an example. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. Wow, Deuteronomy 15:1. Great news for the debtor, but what if you're the person to whom someone owes money? Ceremonial laws were defined as those that dealt with sacrifices, festivals, and the priestly activities. For example, celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress. Deuteronomy 16:13. So we would summarize by saying that moral laws under the traditional approach are universal and timeless. Civil laws apply only to ancient Israel, and ceremonial laws apply only to ancient Israel. There's only one problem with this. These distinctions are rather arbitrary. Often it is difficult to determine which category that a law falls into. So it seems like there is a theological distinction to many of these laws that concern ancient Israel. So let's view the laws from a narrative context. The Old Testament law is firmly embedded into the story of Israel's theological history. For example, the Exodus, the wandering, and the conquest. Viewed from a covenant context, we see that the law is tightly intertwined with the Mosaic covenant. Now, the nature of the covenant is as follows. The Mosaic covenant is tightly associated with Israel's conquest and occupation of the land. Thus, the blessings from the Mosaic covenant are conditional. In the covenant context, the Mosaic covenant is no longer a functional covenant. Old Testament law, as a part of the Mosaic covenant, is no longer applicable over us as a law. So Duval and Hayes suggests that given the nature of the covenant, that we must interpret the law through the grid of New Testament teaching. For example, what did Matthew mean when he cites Jesus saying that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it? Jesus is saying that he did not come to sweep away the righteous demands of the law, but that he came to fulfill these righteous demands. Furthermore, the law, as well as the Old Testament prophets, had prophetic elements, particularly in pointing to the ultimate demands of holiness because of the presence of God. Jesus is the climax of this aspect of salvation history, and he fulfills all the righteous demands in the prophetic foreshadowing of the law and the prophets. So how do we then put this into the framework of our interpretive journey? That is, the 5 steps we've been studying. Well, again, you start at step number 1, and you grasp the text in their town. So we want to study law, any of the law passages, study law like you would narrative. Okay, so you may need to go back and review what we said about narrative, some of the fundamental principles there. Secondly, pay close attention to where Israel is on their journey. Is it in the Exodus? Is it in the wandering section of their journey, or is it in the conquest? So in step 1, we want to ask, how did this law relate to the Old Covenant? What exactly does it govern? What did this concrete expression of law mean to the original audience? In step number 1 of this chapter 19 in your textbook, if you'll take that section and read down through these steps, it will really help you, because they ask a series of questions that will help you determine how to grasp the text in their own town. Okay? So, in other words, has the law that you're studying been given as a response to a specific situation, or is it describing the requirements for Israel as they move into the new land? See, that's a big difference. What other laws are in the immediate context? Is there a connection? Can you probe into the nature of the particular law you're studying and then identify how it relates to the Old Covenant? Does it govern the Israelites' approach to God, or does it govern how they relate to each other? Is it related to agriculture or commerce? Is it specifically tied to the promised land? Okay? Ask these types of questions and then determine what the specific concrete expression of the law meant for the OT audience. Identify clearly then what the law demanded of them. Don't generalize step 1, be specific to them. So in step 1, we want to ask, how did this law relate to the Old Covenant? What exactly does it govern? What did this concrete expression of law mean to the original audience? In step number 1 of this chapter 19 in your textbook, if you'll take that section and read down through these steps, it will really help you, because they ask a series of questions that will help you determine how to grasp the text in their own town. Okay? So, in other words, has the law that you're studying been given as a response to a specific situation, or is it describing the requirements for Israel as they move into the new land? See, that's a big difference. What other laws are in the immediate context? Is there a connection? Can you probe into the nature of the particular law you're studying and then identify how it relates to the Old Covenant? Does it govern the Israelites' approach to God, or does it govern how they relate to each other? Is it related to agriculture or commerce? Is it specifically tied to the promised land? Okay, ask these types of questions and then determine what the specific concrete expression of the law meant for the OT audience. Identify clearly then what the law demanded of them. Don't generalize. Step 1, be specific to them. Now in step number 2, we're measuring the width of the river. In other words, how much difference is there between their situation and ours? We no longer live under the terms of the Old Covenant. We're not preparing to enter the Promised Land. And we don't live under a theocracy. So now we go to step 3. We've got to come up with principles. What is the broad principle that God has given us behind this text that allows for this specific ancient application? Secondly, principles often reflect the character of God, the nature of sin, or concern for other people. Now for the check in step 4. Consult the biblical map. So take the principle that you have come up with and filter it through the grid of the New Testament. Finally, in step 5, grasp the text in our town. Apply the expression from step 4 to specific contemporary situations. All right, class, now that you have had the benefit of this chapter and we've seen some principles here on how to work with the law, I want you to take this example given in your textbook in Leviticus 5 and 2 and see how the authors take this passage, Leviticus 5:2, and they walk it down through each step. So now it's your turn to make application.